So if you want to win a Nobel Prize in economics, the actual decision process isn't that important. There are people who nominate you, and if your card comes up one day, yeah, you win the Nobel. The most important part about getting the prize is making sure you do the work. You want to do something that contributes to economics, that advances the field. So what is it that makes those kind of contributions? Well, in this video, we're going to look at previous winners of the Nobel Prize and look for a pattern to see if there's any indication of the type of work that you could potentially be working on to win a Nobel Prize. And when we find the pattern, we're going to compare it to the actual training that economics majors and PhD students in economics are receiving today. Unfortunately, you're going to see that we're likely setting our students up for failure. I'm filming this on the day that the 2024 prize was announced. So we're going to look at the 2024 winners. Then we'll go back to 2023 and 2022. I'll mention why the Nobel Committee said that they won the prize. I'll also mention some of the work that I like that they've done. And through that, we'll see if we can recognize a pattern in the types of work that they were doing to make a contribution to economics. And I'm sure that you'll actually be able to figure out that pattern before I point out what I see. So today, the Nobel Committee announced that Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and Jim Robinson won the Nobel Prize for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. Now, Acemoglu has been on the short list for a long time. Everyone knew he would eventually win. But the thing is, he could have won probably for a couple of different contributions. This guy is a workhorse. It's amazing how much he writes and how much research he produces. So there are a lot of different things that they could have chosen from to award him the prize, but the fact that they awarded the prize to this trio really means that they're awarding it to this paper on long-run growth and institutions. It's one of the most cited papers in economics. The main argument is that there's a connection between institutions and economic growth, so that institutions are one of the big influencers, or one of the big factors in why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. Now, I keep saying institutions. I should have mentioned that institutions are meant to be like the rules of the game, the humanly devised constraints that govern behavior, right? And so the classic example that I like to give is that if there is oil underneath this room where I'm filming right now, that is a resource constraint, whether there's oil or not. Like, that's a resource constraint, and that's what a lot of people attribute to long-run economic growth and development. Anytime people are talking about climate, about natural resources, about how far away from the equator you are, those are theories of resource constraints, saying that some countries are rich because they have the right resources, and some countries are poor because they have the wrong resources. Institutions say that it's not about whether there's oil under the ground or not. It is, what are the rules around how you use that oil? Who owns that oil? Who decides whether you can drill it or not? How do you market it? Who gets the profits? Those are all rules that determine how the economy functions. And the key difference here is we could take a vote and say, is there oil under this classroom or not? I say classroom. I'm so used to giving this in a classroom. I'm in just a normal room. Is there oil under the ground or not? It doesn't matter whether we take a vote or not. There's oil or there isn't. But if we said that, well, the person who owns the land also owns the oil, we can change that. We could change that today. We could say, no, actually, that oil is owned by the government, or actually that oil is owned by, I don't know, the next 3 landowners, or something, some intersection, right? We could come up with different rules for who owns it, or how are we going to sell it? Are we going to sell it in a free market? Are we going to sell it in a regulated market? Those are all things that humans can decide and change. So that is, to me, what the key characteristic of an institution is. And so they are arguing that institutions are the main factor for economic growth and development. So they go back to colonial times, where you saw a lot of economies starting, a lot of modern economies starting, and they said, what are the rules? What are the institutions that they set up? And they argued that there were places where people wanted to stay and they wanted to build a future. And so they set up institutions that were going to be good growth promoting institutions. They're going to create rules that are more fair. They're going to constrain the executive. They're going to do all these things that help economic development in the long run. And then there were places where people showed up and said, like, nope, we are just going to exploit this place and we're going to make it ours. And we don't care about the rules because we don't plan to live here very long. And so, like, a good example of a contrast of this would be like New England, where you have settlers coming over who are seeking, religious freedom. They want to live in this area, so they set up good institutions. And the contrast to that would be what I look at, which is Haiti, or Saint-Domingue as it was known back then. This is a colony where they're just like, look, we want this thing to produce as much sugar and coffee as possible. We are going to not care about the rules that people set up. We're just going to say, like, what does it take to get the most extraction out of this economy as possible? And then they, make this argument by, collecting data on economic growth and development. But then they go like one step further and say, well, why do some places set up institutions where they want to stay? Like, what makes people want to stay in some areas and not in others? And they say, well, it depends on just basically like how hostile the environment was when they first showed up. How many people are dying? If they show up and people die really easily, they're probably not going to stick around. They don't want to live in that area. They probably want to live in these nicer areas where people aren't dying as frequently. And so they use the settler mortality as a way to get at like why some institutions were different than others, and then they look at long-run economic growth and development. That's this paper. That's the reason why the trio won the Nobel Prize, was basically for this paper that's been cited so many times. Now, I actually think that like most of the main arguments of that paper have been disproved since then. I don't think it stands as strong. But one of the big contributions that this paper makes, besides the fact that it was, we have this argument, but then you look at like fundamentally what did this paper do? And it went beyond just looking at like cross-country regressions, trying to compare like, well, here are some poor countries, here are some rich countries. We're going to look at some factors. Let's throw in climate. Let's throw in resources. Even like rule of law. They put in all these things in their analysis, and hey, look, countries that are good have these things. Countries that are good, rich, countries that are poor are like this. They went beyond that and said, how can we use the logic of causal inference? How can we use the ideas of natural experiments? How can we use these things that happened in the past to help us understand differences across countries and over time? And so they really broke away from what was being done a lot in the 90s and have now done this big path-breaking work, which now at this point, like, that's what everyone does. Like, you wouldn't be able to do the work that was being done before then. You have to say, like, okay, why is there some what we call exogenous in economics, but why is there something what are the underlying factors motivating these differences across countries? And so that's work that has been, validated, at least in the methodology, the approach. And that's something that we just, take as given nowadays. If you're interested in just like a summary of what that work was and related work there, Acemoglu and Robinson wrote a book together called Why Nations Fail. This was very popular. I mean, this is one of those kind of like classic books that you see on the bookshelves of people who are like interested in economics, but not quite getting into the research behind it. I think like this came out right as I was finishing up undergrad, so it was great time for me to get into this book. It has its critiques as well, just as the critiques of the paper. That's fine. I think it does a good job at least of trying to help us understand like what are these institutions, what are these factors that we think are important for economic growth and development. I think the idea of institutions is fundamentally important for economics. The 2023 winner was Claudia Goldin. She was the third woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and she was the first woman to be a solo winner of the prize in economics. So that was a big, momentous work. Why did she get it? She got it for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. Claudia Goldin, I mean, it's not like Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, where there's one paper that is like, clearly this is why this person won. Claudia Goldin has a lifetime of work where she really pioneered the field of gender economics, is what some people call it. It's not quite called gender economics in most places, but really put gender at the focus of economics. I mean, labor economics as a modern study today couldn't be understood without the gender aspect. Like when we have labor supply, trying to understand these different things, like a lot of that comes at the root of what has been happening with women in the labor market. And Claudia Goldin is just like clearly the one that has made, she pioneered that field. She, like in terms of work, again, it's not a single paper, but I have my students read stuff on what she's written on the shift in women's labor market participation. In fact, she wrote this book, Career and Family. I've reviewed it on here. It's one of my most watched videos, Women's Century-Long Journey Toward Equity. The summary in this book, which again, like gets at like what a lot of her work has done, is trying to understand the different phases of women in the labor market, and they track across generations. So I can't remember the full evolution of it off the top of my head, but career and family is effectively the way to understand all these things, right? So you have career, then family, which was this idea of you could have your career, and then like when you want to have a family, you would leave your career and you were just doing family for the rest of your life. You have career or family, I think is one of them. Like you had to choose the path of, you were either going to have a career or you're going to have a family, but you can't have both, right? So if you were a career woman, you just wouldn't end up having kids in the long run. And if you're a family woman, you wouldn't jump back into the labor market. There was family then career, meaning you would have your family, your kids would grow up. Now, what are you supposed to do? Okay, you go out into the labor market and you start your jobs. And then the last one, I haven't gotten these quite in the right order, I'm sure. And I know I think there's one more that I'm missing. But the last one is career and family. And that is the current generation trying to understand how women have both a career and a family. What are the economics that have motivated that? What are the economics that have enabled that? And this book does a fantastic job. I mean, it's one of my all-time favorite books on economics. I've lent the book to my neighbor. He read it, then his teenage daughter read it, then his wife read it, right? Like it cut across a lot of different demographics because it's a very relevant and interesting topic in economics. And so, yeah, it's no wonder that Claudia Goldin won a Nobel Prize for doing something that fundamentally shifted the field of economics and created new fields. Finally, I'm going to do the 2022 winners. That's Ben Bernanke, Douglas Diamond, and Philip Dybvig. They got it for research on banks and financial crises. Now, I'm not as familiar with Diamond and Dybvig. I know that they did their work on a model of banking panics and deposit insurance. It's not the part that I'm most familiar with. But I do know a little bit about Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke, of course, was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from about 2006 to, 2015? Or I don't even think it was that late. But before that, he was a professor at Princeton, where he was doing work on the spread of financial panics and just like the financial system and how fragile it was and what you needed to do to protect it when panics come. One of my favorite papers by Ben Bernanke is one where he was looking at the Great Depression, and he's pushing back a little bit on Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz on their arguments on the monetary causes of the Great Depression. He doesn't disagree with them, but there had been this back and forth of like what caused the Great Depression. And so Friedman and Schwartz came out and said, look, the money supply was super important. We had monetary contraction. It led to deflation, and that's what really caused the Great Depression. And the Federal Reserve could have fought that. They could have come out, expanded the money supply, and we could have not had as severe a depression or maybe just a recession if the Fed had done what it was supposed to do. Ben Bernanke absolutely does not disagree with that. But the paper that I like that he wrote is about like the other things that we lost during the Great Depression that weren't money, weren't like monetary causes, but were what we would call real causes, things that happened in the real economy that were important for the Great Depression happening. And so he focused on banking panics. So he had all these bank panics where people would come in, they would withdraw their money, the bank would fail. And then he pointed out that when those banks fail, this is a time where the relationship between the bank and the lender was really important. So I would get a loan from the bank to fund my business, to fund my farm, whatever it is that I need to fund. And then, my banker knows who I am, right? We have a personal relationship. They know if I'm a good guy or not. They know that like, oh, hey, I wasn't able to make my payment this month. That's fine. Like, the banker says, because I know you're a good guy. I know that you pay regularly, and I can see that you had a legitimate issue this month, like you had a medical emergency, or like, your tractor broke down. I can see what happened. I know that's not a long-term problem. Don't worry. Like, we have a real relationship right here. I'm going to forgive you, or like I'll work with you, because I would much rather have you continue to make your payments than try to like have you go into default, chase after you, and have all this other problems going on. So it's this real relationship between the banker and the borrower. I think I said lender earlier, but I meant the borrower, who that allowed a lot of the economy to function. Bernanke points out that when these banks fail, those bankers go out of work. The borrower no longer has that relationship, and now they have to go to a new bank. And they don't have that relationship with that banker. So this new banker is like, okay, is this a reliable borrower? Is this someone that I can trust who will make their regular payments? Or is this somebody who is trying to take advantage of the fact that this bank has failed, and so now they have no history? They can disguise themselves as a good, reliable payer. And so this helped us understand a little bit more about like how these financial panics don't just go from, okay, banks are closed. Like, well, can't other banks function? No, other banks can't function because this real relationship between people has a big impact on whether these loans actually function. So Ben Bernanke, I'm more familiar with his work, and it's really interesting work. And it was crucial for when he became chairman of the Federal Reserve and was in the biggest financial panic we'd had since the Great Depression. And he was able to draw on that understanding of studying the Great Depression and other financial panics and saying, what do we need to do today to make sure we don't repeat the problems of what we went through in the Great Depression? Okay, so those are the three most recent winners, and the work seems just completely unrelated. Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson are getting it for stuff in like economic growth and development, or institutional economics, however you want to pose it. You have Claudia Goldin winning for labor economics and gender economics, and you have Bernanke, Nyman, and Dybvig for their work on finance, financial panics, banking. I mean, honestly, these are three basically unrelated fields. You can stretch yourself and say, like, what are the commonalities between them? But, like, any argument you make for two of them being similar, the third one is certainly going to be left out of that. So what patterns can we discern from these three winners that would give us a hint on what kind of work we should be doing to advance the frontier and win a Nobel Prize one day? Well, the thing that all three of these have in common is that the work that supported their advances was all in economic history. Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are looking at the history of economies, not just the colonial ones that I mentioned in that one paper. They've got papers looking at the Napoleonic Wars. They've got papers looking at Columbia and gold mines. They do a ton of work in economic history and how that then affects just the differences across countries in the long run. Claudia Goldin, her work is on the history of women in the labor force. It's all diving into the archives, trying to understand, getting data that we didn't have before because women were often ignored when we were trying to understand economics and participation in the labor force because they weren't in the labor force. And then Ben Bernanke, who I focused on a lot, but of course I'm in DivDigger doing a little bit of this too. He's studying the Great Depression. He's trying to understand the economic history and what that teaches us. And then he applies those lessons later on. Economic history is like economic theory, both micro and macro, and econometrics. It's a tool that cuts across fields and is an essential part of advancing economic thought. And that's why I'm a little bit afraid for the future. When I finished my PhD in economics at Yale in 2017, I had a hard time finding a job. I understand that part of this is on me in that maybe my research wasn't as good back then. And certainly today, as I look back on it, I realize wow, that research could have been a lot better. My research today is much better. So gratefully, I'm growing and progressing. So part of that was on me. But another part was that I was coming out with a dissertation in economic history. If you go today and look at the job openings for economists, today when I looked it up, there were 651 jobs available for economists with a PhD. Now, this is going to understate how many jobs are actually out there for economists because they many of these have multiple listings. So I'll say hiring 2 professors, and I just counted each of the links. So it's a bit of an undercount of how many job openings there are. So out of those 651, how many are available in the different tools that are essential for progress, right? So econometrics, fundamentals tool that you need to do economics nowadays. There were 94 openings that were looking specifically for someone with econometrics. Macroeconomic theory, again, a big one that's kind of like a core in what we do in teaching economics. There were 109 openings. Microeconomic theory, similar to macro, 110 openings. If you look today, how many are asking specifically for an economic historian to apply? There are only 12. 12 across all 651 jobs. Now, for all of these fields, this is going to be somewhat of an undercount because a lot of these job openings say they're just accepting applications in any field. And there are certainly many positions that would be willing to hire an economic historian to come in and work there. But those are also positions where they're looking for an econometrician, a microeconomist, a macroeconomist. So I still think this is useful and informative. There just are not that many positions available for economic historians. That's one of the reasons why I struggled on the job market, is that it looks like there's not a lot of demand for economic historians. What's going on here? Well, my colleague, Matt Dremsky, surveyed the top 50 economics programs, at least in the US. I can't remember if it went outside the US. Only 8 of them require their graduate students to take economic history. Here's the list right here. You'll notice something interesting about this list, that if you know about our laureates in economics, so if you take today's winners and look at the U.S. institutions they're in, you have MIT in Chicago. Last year, Claudia Goldin, she's at Harvard, and Ben Bernanke, he's not in academics anymore, but he was at Princeton when he was. None of those institutions are on this list. That's wild to me, that the laureates who are winning prizes for their work, their students aren't even required to take economic history. Now, obviously, economic history is an option, but imagine telling your students that econometrics, totally optional. Don't worry. We know that that's the main skill that people need to have to be on the job market nowadays. But don't worry about taking econometrics. Theory, no one, you can take it or leave it. You don't really need any type of economic theory to succeed in the job market today. It's wild that these tools that are so important to advancing economic thought, microeconomic theory, macroeconomic theory, econometrics, and economic history, we're just deciding to drop one of those. And when we see that, that is the type of work that leads to major advancements, it's also really a shame because right now, like, it's one of the best times to do economic history in terms of what we're able to do. We're seeing that that's what's being rewarded at the highest level of our field, and that it's going to continue to be awarded most likely. A lot of people think Joel Mokyr is on the short list for Nobel Prize because of his work in the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the John Bates Clark Medal, which is kind of like the mini Nobel, this is for a young economist. It often predicts who's going to win the Nobel Prize. Acemoglu won it, got one. Two of the recent winners, Melissa Dell and Dave Donaldson, both did work in economic history, and that's why they received the award. Like, it looks like we've got a pipeline coming up where more economic historians are going to be winning the Nobel Prize. It seems like we still care and want economists to understand economic history, even if we're not requiring them to actually learn any. And another reason why economic history is just such a fruitful field right now is that we're getting data that we've never had before. Like, we've done a lot of American economic history, but that was like with really sparse data. Now we're starting to get like individual count census data. We're getting like big data where we're linking people across censuses. We're able to study basically any individual in the US and trying to understand like the big picture stuff that's been happening there. So we're getting deeper and deeper into US economic history and some of the more developed countries using bigger and bigger data. But at the same time, we're going into countries that we've never gone before, and we're able to do work that hasn't been done. So I mean, it's weird to say that I'm pioneering. I don't want to say pioneering because that makes it sound like a little too big, but I'm doing work in Haiti, which is a small country, really interesting country, something that is just terribly understudied. But the reason why it was understudied is because we just didn't have the data on the history of Haiti. And I've been going in, thanks to the resources that allow us to find and share data nowadays, I'm bringing out some of the first in Haiti's economic history and helping to develop the picture there. I mean, we need way more work done in lots of African countries. We've got like India and China, some of our biggest economies. The economic history work done there is very sparse at this point relative to what we see in like the US and England. There are so many opportunities available to do economic history right now, and they're going to bring out all these really interesting insights. And that leads to a third thing, is that along with getting more data, AI is like tailor-made for helping economic history. Like, we're seeing advances in how we're able to read documents, how we're able to link documents, how we're able to just find more and more using AI as a tool to help us dive into economic history. And I actually think that economic history is one of the fields that is more immune to AI taking over those jobs, because the whole point of economic history is uncovering the data that AI hasn't gotten yet, right? Like, you have to go into the archives, you have to find the original data, you have to find all these things that haven't made it into the records that have trained the AIs that are, threatening so much work today. So I actually think that if you're interested in doing research and you want to do something that's not just like, oh yeah, AI can already do that, like, economic history is a prime candidate for the future. I also think that students who are studying economics just for like edification, for their for trying to understand the world, like, that is what most people think they're going to be able to do when they study economics. A lot of people get to economics thinking, yeah, I'm going to understand the Great Depression, I'm going to understand the Great Recession, I'm going to understand the Industrial Revolution, or like, I want to be able to understand how we got to the world today. And they're being let down because we just don't teach economic history anymore. And what's happening at our top universities, producing the professors that then teach in the other universities, is an indicator that, like, hey, yeah, we don't think economic history is important, and so we're not going to train economic historians, and so now you won't have economic historians to teach your classes. Your classes then go out of the catalog, and then you just don't even have a reason to teach economic history, and so we stop learning economic history, and that's a problem. It's abdicating one of our major fields, one of our major tools, to just the historians. And historians, while they have obviously their strengths in being able to dive into history and trying to understand context, a lot of times they haven't had the proper economic training to actually understand what is going on when they're looking at that data. And so our economic history is going to be more and more skewed towards people who have a really good understanding of history, but not a very good understanding of economics. And the economists who fight back will have a good training in economics, but not a very good training in history. And so there's going to be this really big gap in our just global understanding of economics if we don't have people trained in economic history. I think it's a shame in the patterns that we're seeing in economic education. Now, I mentioned my difficulties in finding a job when I graduated. I did find an initial job, and they hired me not because I was an economic historian, but because I had, the types of skills that you can use across lots of different fields. But then I got a job where I am today at Utah State University. And the reason why I got this job is because we have a dean in our business school who realizes the importance of economic history. He said, I want my students to come out understanding how America got to where they are. If that's, they're going to be working in America, they should understand the history and the institutions that created America. And so we teach hundreds of undergraduates economic history every semester. And it's fantastic to see that these students, they love the topic. They get so much more interested in economics when they can get into economic history. And I hope that we can get more colleges that catch that vision of the importance of economic history, because the Nobel Committee is trying to tell you that this is important.